Welcome back, friend. What's it been, 23 hours? Man, you can't get enough of me, can you? No, I haven't grown too big for my britches, Chester. You got any ideas for pre-show small talk? Yeah, I didn't think so. Anyway, let's head inside. I'd hate to keep our pal in there waiting. Friend, meet Ghost Fella. Ghost Fella, meet friend. As long as he keeps quiet and behaves himself, he'll get along just fine. But as we're about to find out, not all unwanted guests are so good-natured. Ooh, it's the Crimson Hour here at my weekend abode, so we better get started, cause when that last lick of light fades away, it's gonna be you, me, and whatever's in these walls waiting for the lights to go out. Our tale tonight is brought to you by author Frederick Pangbourne. Frederick has sadly passed on, but he's left a legacy of horror in his wake, and we mean to keep that legacy alive. So without further delay, from our old pal Frederick Pangbourne, I give you Hour of the Witch. Before I indulge you in this unfathomable and unfortunate story, I have but one question. Do you believe in witches? No? Well, who can blame you? Old haggard-looking women with black pointed hats and long wart-covered noses. The whole concept seems almost laughable, really. Especially when you see them portrayed in cartoons and on television shows. Well, I was exactly like that at one point. The king of skeptics. Ghosts, flying saucers, and the supernatural were irrational beliefs that were only regarded by those with overactive imaginations and little common sense. I wish I felt the same way now, because even though flying saucers are still ridiculous to imagine, the supernatural is real. Very real. I found that out the hard way, but I digress. Perhaps it's best if I start at the beginning. The house may have been exceedingly more than I needed, but the price was something that could not be ignored. An old 2-story house on the outskirts of a small, practically uninhabited Pennsylvania town called Madden. With a population of nearly 500, the town sat just short of the New York border, somewhere north of Coudersport. I had recently retired at the early age of 53 from a hectic Wall Street job in lower Manhattan, and I now desired some place far from the perpetual bustles of the city. Somewhere quiet and unpopulated, void of any pestering neighbors and secluded enough where I could modestly rest and contemplate my future as a young retiree. I had unknowingly stumbled upon the house through one of the many real estate sites that are out there nowadays, and it was exactly what I had been searching for, sequestered from any nearby homes and surrounded by many acres of wooded land. Where else could I find such a home and at such a price? It was only when I had physically arrived at the property to survey the house firsthand that I discovered why the house had remained on the market for as long as it had, and priced at such a discounted amount.
As you can see, Mr. Bradford, though the house has remained on the market for several months, its previous owners, who spent a considerable amount to renovate both the exterior and the interior, well maintained it.
My realtor, a Mr. Harry Lawther, stated as he escorted me up the front steps of the home's lengthy porch. I nodded silently as I took in what he had said, while also observing the condition of the home's exterior, which was, as he had stated, well maintained. How old is the house?
I believe it was constructed sometime in the early 1800s,
he replied as he punched in the code to the Realtor key box secured on the door handle.
However, despite its age, each owner of the house contributed something to its upkeep and many improvements.
If the house was maintained and improved as much as you're saying, then why has it gone through numerous owners? I saw on the site that each of the many owners sold the house within a few years of owning it. Is there something I should know that explains such a cheap price? I inquired as Mr. Lawther was now opening the front door with the retrieved key.
If you're wondering if anyone was murdered in the house, then the answer is no,
he commented over his shoulder. Well, what's the catch then? There's obviously something that was omitted from the home's description. With the door unlocked and pushed open, he stood on its threshold and faced me.
Well, I guess there's no way to tiptoe around the answer, so I'll just say it.
Please do.
The previous owners claimed the house was haunted,
he blatantly said, and waited for my reaction. Haunted? I was close to laughing in his face. Really? Are you serious? He shrugged and stepped into the house with me in tow.
I know. I don't believe in ghosts myself, but that's what they all claimed. They felt that some evil presence was in the house.
He again stopped and faced me for a reaction. I'm sorry if I find the whole matter funny, but I don't believe in any of that nonsense either. What did they exactly say happened? I was finding the topic as curious as it was entertaining. He sighed deeply and leaned against the newel post of the rising staircase in the foyer.
Since we're on the subject, I suppose I should tell you the full story, even though it's probably not in my best interest.
I found myself nodding with an idiotic grin on my face. I felt like a kid sitting around the campfire, about to be told a ghost story.
Apparently, this house was originally owned by a witch, or so I'm told. There was a tragic incident long ago where she was allegedly killed on the premises. The house had remained vacant for many years afterwards until the happening, and the witch herself was eventually forgotten. It was generations later that the estate fell into the hands of the township and was in due time placed on the market. There's not too much else I know besides that. Again, this is all based on old rumors.
He concluded his tale and waited in silence. That is quite some story. Still, it doesn't change my belief in those things, and I would greatly like to see the rest of the house. Mr. Lawther smiled with an exhale of relief and began his tour of the home's interior. As you can already guess, I committed to the house with little to no regard for Mr. Lawther's obviously fabricated story. I had not seen a man that pleased with the sale in, well, never. Once the necessary stack of paperwork was completed, I arranged a moving company to haul my belongings from my apartment out here to God's country. Because the trip was so far out of the way of their normal routes, I had to wait just short of a week for my furnishings to arrive, which meant I'd be roughing it in an empty house until they arrived. Boredom eventually set in after the first 2 days of being isolated in the house and surrounding country. I decided out of pure inactivity to take a trip to the town hall to do a little research into my newly acquired home and its history. I guess I did this not only out of boredom, but subconsciously to reinforce my belief that such things, such as witches, did not exist, and to shed some light on this false claim. The Madden Town Hall was smaller than my new home, if you can imagine that. And once I inquired about the records pertaining to the house to an elderly librarian by the name of Francis, I was directed to a small office in the back of the building. I was told that a Mr. Hamey was the town's historian, and he could help me in this matter. So to the back office I went. The office was hidden down a short hall in the back of the building and next to a janitor's closet. The door to Mr. Hamey's office had frosted glass with his name printed on it. I knocked twice before being invited inside. Mr. R. Hamey, as the nameplate on his desk read, was an older man who I surmised was in his early 70s. Though once I stepped into the smoke-filled office and observed a marble ashtray on his desk filled with crushed cigarette butts, he may have actually been younger. "What can I do for you, young man?" he asked in a gravelly voice as he looked up from the papers on his desk. "Good afternoon. I was told that you might be able to help me." I could already feel the cigarette smoke seeping into my hair and clothing. He gestured to the empty chair in front of his desk, and I took a seat in the tiny filing cabinet-filled office. "So, what can I help you with, Mr.?" "I'm sorry, Larry Bradford," I said, extending my hand across his desk, which he weakly shook. "I recently purchased the vacant house up—" "The which house?" he cut in. "Yes, I heard someone had moved into the house." "Yes, that's correct. But how—" "This is a small town, Mr. Bradford," he again interjected, "with a whole lot of nothing going on here. So when something as insignificant as a house being sold happens, the news travels fast, especially when it's that house." He leaned back in his chair and fished a cigarette from a pack in the breast pocket of his shirt. "So you know about the house and are aware of the story? About the witch?" "I do," he said as he lit up the cigarette. "So the story, is it true?" "Well, that depends on who you ask." He leaned forward and rested his smoke in the ashtray. "There are dozens of different stories floating around town. I can, however, tell you what I know based on the town's records." I nodded my head. "Please do." "The house belonged to a woman named Alida Svasta. Not much is known about her except that she came over from a more ancient part of the world back in the 1800s. A man named Andrew Kipner had originally built the house. He was a big-shot tycoon from Pittsburgh who made his money in the steel industry. He had the house built as a hunting lodge for when he came out this way. But sadly, he passed away shortly after they built the home. The Kipner family, none of which were remotely any type of hunter, decided it was best that the house be put up for sale. And that's where Alida Svasta comes into the picture." "She bought the house?" Amy nodded, taking another drag from his cigarette. "Yes. No one knows where she came from exactly, or why she decided to settle here of all places. But nevertheless, she acquired the house back in the early 1800s. Perhaps she decided a place as remote as Madden would provide her with the perfect surroundings to continue her." He looked up to the ceiling, searching for the correct words. "Religious beliefs." "Witchcraft," I blurted out. "Amongst other things. It was said that she abducted and ate children from the town. Some claimed that she worshipped a demon, and that blood sacrifices were a necessity to appease this entity and gain her unnatural abilities." He ground out the remains of his cigarette into the ashtray, along with the pile of others. "You don't believe all that, do you?" "Who can say, Mr. Bradford?" he said, pulling another cigarette from the pack. "It all took place long before my time. But that's what people testified to in the old newspapers we have on file." "The crimes are true, as they are also filed away in the police archives. What is undocumented is what the people of Madden did one day. Afraid to confront her at night, a group of townspeople stormed the house and dragged Alida Svasta from it in broad daylight. She was beaten and tortured, and finally set on fire right in front of the house. When the people returned that night to dispose of her remains, she was gone. Some claim she returned to the house, never to be seen again. Ever since then, the house has remained empty until these recent years without incident. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled heavily as I took in the alluring story. No offense, Mr. Hamey, but I find the entire story to be unconvincing, be it as it may. I just don't believe in those sorts of things. Well, you asked me, and I'm just telling you what I know from our own files. Since it is the highlight of this boring town, I know it quite well. My suggestion to you, Mr. Bradford, is to leave the house as the others did. Put it back on the market and leave it empty, as it was meant to be. The others before you came to that conclusion in due time, and I can assuredly say that you too will soon find out why the others abandoned that house of atrocities. I stood from my chair. All this nonsense about witches and demons was wearing thin. I could only hear so much, even though I was the one who came to him. I outstretched my hand again, and he shook it. Well, I thank you for your time, Mr. Hamey. I appreciate the information. Smiling, I walked from the office into town hall with the stench of cigarette smoke lingering over me, and wondered why Mr. Lawther had failed to mention murdered children. I arrived back at the house sometime near 6 that evening. I made a pit stop at the local sporting goods shop and purchased a few items for my brief stay in the empty house. A camping cot and heavy blankets were at the top of the list. I also picked up a pizza from the town's only pizzeria for the evening's dinner and possibly tomorrow's breakfast. I couldn't really say what made the house feel different when I pulled up in front of it, but it now seemed transformed, taking on a slightly more ominous presence. I laughed at myself for letting Hamey's narrative sink in and take hold of my imagination. To make matters worse, when I stepped inside, I paused in the foyer and stood silently listening to the eerie stillness of the house. As my eyes wandered about the barren interior, I listened intently for any type of noise which may suggest I was not alone. When none came, I laughed again at my naive foolishness, then shouted out in the best Ricky Ricardo voice,
Svasta, I'm home, you old bitch.
As I predicted, no reply was returned, so I proceeded to bring my purchases inside. The evening passed uneventfully as I entertained myself for hours by reading some dime store novel that I picked up along my travels in town, dined on cold pizza, and sporadically played on my cell phone. Though the house had the electricity and water turned on, it lacked everything else. No curtains, chairs, or my bed, a small price to pay until the arrival of my furniture, along with the cable company. The mundane book and monotonous phone games soon lost my interest, and I found myself exploring the house in more detail, investigating inside the kitchen pantry and its many cabinets, along with all the closets in their rooms. How long I leisurely roamed about, peeking behind doors and taking in the house on a personal level, I could not say. It was not until I came upon a slender hall closet on the second floor that I discovered something that piqued my interest greater than both my book and phone. I was reaching my hand up to the highest shelf and feeling about when my fingers fell upon something. Grasping the item, I pulled it down into view. It was nothing more than a single standard white envelope, its surface covered with a thin layer of dust. I glanced up and down the hall as if I were to find the responsible party to my find standing nearby, watching my discovery. Obviously, I stood alone in the hall. Blowing off the dust, I carefully opened the sealed envelope. Inside, I found a single piece of folded paper. Unfolding the parchment, I saw it contained only 2 handwritten sentences in black. She walks in the hour of the dead. Never speak her name. Nothing more, nothing less. I again glanced up and down the hall, expecting to be the brunt of some joke, before rereading the words. I rubbed my chin and silently mouthed the words. My first thought was that my realtor had left a note behind as some type of joke to frighten me, but I realized that the coating of dust on the envelope suggested otherwise. One of the previous owners, perhaps. It was a distinct possibility. Hour of the dead? I said aloud as I studied the paper. I went to check my phone, but realized I had left it in the bedroom I was staying in, just a few rooms down. With the paper in hand, I walked to the bedroom. It only took a couple of minutes to log onto my phone and research Hour of the Dead. The definition read as follows: the witching hour, or sometimes known as the Hour of the Dead, is a time at night that is associated with supernatural events, whereby witches, demons, and ghosts are thought to appear and be at their most powerful. The time associated is immediately after midnight to 1 a.m. I turned my attention back to the paper's warning, and then to the time on the phone. 11:56. It was then that my phone shut off. As much as I tried to reboot it, nothing worked. It was as if something had instantly drained the battery from the device in the snap of a finger. Frustrated, I tossed the dead electronic on the bed. I then recalled the warning and quickly held it up again. Never speak her name. My mind immediately recalled the moment I arrived at the house today and what I had said aloud. I wondered if reciting the awful name was forbidden during the defined hour or while in the house. Somewhere on the first floor, a door slammed suddenly, jarring me from my skeptical thoughts. Despite my affirmed reluctance on the far-fetched subject at hand, I now felt an icy chill run up my spine, and I found myself frightened. Very frightened. "Hello? Is someone there?" I called out in a voice lacking any form of authority. Outside my bedroom door, there was only silence. "Hello?" The sound was in no manner imaginary, and the thought of someone else being in the house caused me to step out into the hall. I stood quietly in the corridor and turned my attention to the end of the hall, where the stairwell leading downstairs began. All the lights had remained on as I roamed through the house, and the light from the downstairs foyer illuminated the unseen portion of the stairs that led to a landing, then wrapped around a bend as it descended. I was contemplating on calling out again or going down to the first floor, when a shadow passed by at the foot of the stairs where I could not see. The shadow was visible only for a moment on the stairwell wall, as someone below passed by. "Hello? Who's there?" I exclaimed with rediscovered strength. "Whoever you are, you're trespassing." With my courage holden, I stomped heavily down the hall to the stairs, being sure to announce my arrival and hopefully scare whoever may be in the house. Still treading loudly, I paused at the landing and looked down the rest of the stairs. I could see a portion of the front door and the foyer from where I stood. The front door was closed. "I called the police, so you'd best—" A sound I never would have expected cut my false threat off. It was the distinct sound of a sobbing child. The cries were without a doubt coming from somewhere on the first floor. I no longer knew what to make of my nightly intruder. Had one of the town's children snuck into the house on some sort of dare? "Hello?" I began to slowly descend the remaining stairs. "Are you okay?" I had only taken a few steps when the shadow appeared again. A slender shape that stretched from somewhere unseen. its head and shoulders elongated on the wood floor, almost touching the bottom step. The sobbing suddenly ceased and was now replaced with a rasping wheeze of someone breathing with strained difficulty. My mouth opened to say something. What, I do not know. But before I could gather the words, the entire downstairs went black. Like my cell phone, all the lights on the first floor went dead, casting everything past the last couple of steps into a lightless void. It was then a shape, blacker than the darkest below, moved into view just beyond the light cast from the upstairs hall. It was the unmistakable form of a person. When their head lifted and met my gaze, I saw its shining pinpointed eyes. I shrieked like a frightened boy and stumbled madly up the stairs. A malevolent cackle flowed from behind me in the darkness below. My breathing was coming in rapid panic gasps as I fell onto the hallway floor. I laid there on my back, propped up on my elbows, watching the stairwell. Slow, plodding steps were now ascending the stairs. I frantically scrambled on all fours as I headed to the bedroom. Just as I was about to crawl into the room, I threw one last glance down the hall toward the stairs. Whoever it was, I glimpsed the top of their head as they drew near the top. Long black matted hair, and a partial view of the Stygian face and shining eyes rose higher just as the hall light was extinguished. It was all I needed to see to confirm that a physical being was indeed in the house and not some illusional shadow. I scurried into the room and slammed the door closed behind me with my foot. No sooner had the door been forcefully closed, I was on my feet and locking it by its knob. With the door secured, I took a few steps back while listening to the approaching footfalls. My hands trembled as I wiped the growing perspiration from my face. My mouth was dry and void of saliva. Just as the audible footsteps reached the door, they stopped. Whoever it was now stood on the opposite side. I clearly heard the rasping breathing. I found my teeth biting down hard on my lower lip in a confused panic as I took another step back, trying to anticipate what would come next. Nothing had occurred though, and the heavy wheezing breath stopped. A deathly silence filled the air as I waited. It seemed as if I stood staring at the door for an eternity, when it was in fact only perhaps several seconds. Then the cries started. From outside the door, a cacophony of childlike sobs began. This time it sounded more of a multitude of children.
"Help us, sister,"
the saddened voices called out.
"Open the door and let us in, please. It's dark out here. Don't let her find us."
The sound of the children's pleas was almost as terrifying as the thing that ascended the stairs. Part of me wanted to believe that there were actually frightened children on the opposite side pleading for help, and I almost, out of pure empathy, reached out for the doorknob. Logic then took center stage and convinced me that the chances that children were in the house were next to none. It was nothing more than a clever ploy from what really waited. The sobbing pleas stopped abruptly and were followed by a barrage of vigorous poundings. The sudden noise causing me to flinch, and as suddenly as they had begun, they ceased, leaving the room in an eerie silence once more. As I stood staring at the only barrier that stood between me and the morbid specter of Alitas Vasta, I attempted to plan out a possible escape. In the tomb-like stillness, I concluded I could either take my chances on what awaited me beyond the door and try to retrieve my car keys from the kitchen counter and make a mad dash out of the house and to the vehicle, or climb out of one of the bedroom windows and drop from the second story, hoping there would be no injury, and make a mad dash a few miles into town. I was only lying to myself when it came to having the undaunted courage to open the door and face the awaiting horror. Instead, I would take my chances with the second-story window. I nodded in agreement at my decision and turned around to the windows. I froze in a state of organized terror at what my eyes fell upon. My cot was no longer empty. Someone was laying in it, with the white blanket drawn completely over them, concealing their identity. It was only when the wheezing started that I realized what it was. The thought of fleeing the room fled from me as easily as my feet became rooted to the floor. To my horrific dismay, I watched as the body slowly sat up at the waist. As it rose, the blanket slipped away from it, revealing the grotesque monstrosity beneath. Alita Svasta was very much alive, unnaturally defying her countless years of death as she sat up. Her long, oily black hair dangled across her face and hung past her shoulders, her naked body still displaying her burnt, blackened flesh from the night of her supposed demise. The seared skin crepitated as she moved, the incinerated flesh falling off into flaked pieces. My mouth fell open and my eyes bulged from their sockets in horror at what I was bearing witness to. I felt a hot stream of urine running down my leg, staining my pants. I quivered uncomfortably as I stepped uneasily backwards, stopping as I backed into the closed door. She was now rising from the cot, the blanket falling from her blackened form to the floor. Her scorched body stood slightly hunched over and her arms dangled at her sides, the ends of her charred fingers ending in long pointed nails. Her head slowly lifted until her boiled white eyes met my own. The cartilage from her seared face had been melted away, revealing a hole in her face where there should have been a nose. From a mouth without lips came the malevolent cackle again as she stepped forward. No, 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 I whimpered as she neared, the stench of burnt flesh filling my nostrils. This could not be happening, my desperate mind screamed as its only explanation for what I beheld was some demented nightmare which I could not awaken from. Witches do not exist. They do not exist. They do not exist, my unhinged sanity shouted. Her arms lifted and outstretched in a welcoming embrace as she stepped closer, the laughter growing louder as those talons spread open. Behind me, a relentless pounding began on the door, followed by the howling screams of the tormented souls of the children who met their untimely deaths in this house. The door vibrated angrily against my back. For reasons unknown, perhaps to avoid the hideous disfigurement that was preparing to embrace me, my eyes turned just over its shoulder to the back of the room. There, in the darkened corner, stood a black silhouette, a dark, unmoving humanoid shape void of details, and whose malformed head displayed curved horns. All the wretched horrors that had been absorbed into the mortared bricks and weathered planks of this cursed structure had manifested to observe the demise of yet another non-believer. Just as I felt her blackened arms wrap about me, and the overwhelming stench of cooked human flesh assault my senses, She pressed her lipless mouth against my own, just before the lights in the room extinguished, casting everything into pitch black. I screamed as I too was ingested into the vile darkness of the house. After her second series of unresponsive knocks, she tried the door. The front door pushed open with ease. Harry Lawther turned and looked over his shoulder from the front porch to his car parked next to Bradford's silver BMW in the gravel driveway. His gaze then wandered to the surrounding densely packed trees of the property. Odd how silent it always was here, he thought. Not even a call from a bird. Shrugging off the eerie sensation, he pushed the door open wider and stepped through the threshold, closing the door behind him.
Mr. Bradford,
he called out into the gloomy interior of the house, his voice bouncing off the bare walls of the empty abode.
Mr. Bradford.
He waited for a moment, then stepped deeper into the house, clutching his attaché case close to his body.
Mr. Bradford, I have a few more papers for you to sign like we discussed.
His shoes were audible on the wood flooring as he walked about the first floor. When it became obvious that he was not on the ground floor, he made his way to the staircase. It was a possibility that he was still asleep in one of the bedrooms with the door closed. He threw a glance at his wristwatch. 10:36. A tad late to be sleeping in his opinion, but who was he to judge? He stopped at the foot of the stairs and peered up to the first landing.
Mr. Bradford, it's Harry from the Realtor's office.
His voice again reverberating off the barren interior. Looking down at his feet in the bottom step, he debated if it would be rude to ascend the stairs and continue his search. The last thing he wanted was to walk into the man's bedroom and find him in bed, or worse, with a woman. He looked up at the landing and placed one foot on the bottom step. It was then that the floorboards from above him creaked, suggesting movement from the upper hallway. A shadow now appeared on the stairwell wall, showing that someone was standing at the top of the stairs, unseen from the turn in the staircase.
Mr. Bradford?
He asked weakly. A fear of unknown origins was seeping into him, a fear which told him it was not Larry Bradford at the top of the stairs, but something malevolent, awaiting him to foolishly ascend to the second floor. Behind him came the sound of the front door in the foyer being opened, and he quickly turned to watch the door slowly open inward by no physical means. He spun back to the stairs. The shadow was no longer visible. He scurried out of the house, taking advantage of its direct suggestion. There was obviously nothing or no one upstairs that he wanted to encounter. Outside, he rushed off the porch, stumbling off the last 2 steps, and stopped at his car. He turned back to the house, just in time to see the front door leisurely closing on its own. His hand shook as he dug into the pocket of his blazer and removed his cell phone. After dialing, he held the quaking phone to his ear.
Hank? It's Harry from the Realtor's office. No, my car's fine, but I need you to tow away a car for me. Yeah, that's right. I'm up here now. The sooner the better. I'm up here by myself. Okay. Yeah, same as the others. Gone. Didn't even last a week. Thanks. And again, hurry.
Hanging up the phone, he glanced up at one of the second-story windows in the house's face. In a window stood a black silhouette, the outline of the long hair suggesting it was a female. Though the face was obscure, he could feel its ominous gaze on him from afar. The phone fell from his shaking hand, and he promptly scooped it up from the graveled stone. When he stood upright again and looked to the window, the shape was gone. He then scrambled into his car and rolled up the windows and locked the doors. There he sat, nervously awaiting Hank in his tow truck to carry out a task that was not the first, nor he feared would it be the last. And that was Hour of the Witch by author Frederick Pangbourne. A good reminder that when a house is suspiciously affordable, there's usually a good reason for it. Yeah, thanks again for the discount, you ethereal prick. A little about the author. Frederick Pangbourne was a short story author with over 100 stories to his credit, and the majority of them in publication. He was a retired law enforcement officer and former U.S. Marine. And again, a special thanks to his brother Robert Pangbourne, who's partnered with us to keep Frederick's legacy going. Robert himself is an amazing artist who we insist that you check out. You can find him on Facebook as R.F. Pangbourne, Pangborn, and at PangbourneRF at Instagram. His paintings are fucking horrifying. Thanks, Robert, and thanks, Fred. Gone but not forgotten. The Crimson Hour is a production of the Sinister Somnolence Network. All narration and audio production by yours truly. Co-produced by Geoff Sturtevant. You can follow me on Facebook for news and upcoming releases on both this show and Drew Blood's Dark Tales, my Friday night show on Chillin' Tales for Dark Nights. I hope to see you there too. But hey, while we're here, please hit all those obligatory buttons and share if you don't mind. We'd really appreciate it. The Crimson Hour is accepting submissions. If you've got a story or two you'd like to be featured on this show, send it to drewbloodhorror@gmail.com. If selected, you'll get the full treatment. Well, the Crimson Hour's over, and you know what that means. Things are about to get dark around here. So thanks as always for joining me tonight, friends. Remember, if you'd be so kind as to add a review to Apple Podcasts, I'll make sure to shout it out on the show. Of course, simple ratings are also appreciated. I just don't know who to thank for them. And if you're here on YouTube, feel free to hit that like button and say hi below. I read all your comments. Also, if you want to support me in what I do and also have a little fun while you're doing it, become one of my patrons. It sure helps me and Old Chester out. Simply go to patreon.com/drewblood. Sign up and secure my eternal gratitude. And with that, safe travels, friend. I'll see you all next time at the Crimson Hour.